The approach of Daniel Walden's 90th birthday makes this a good time to sit down and preserve a record of his remarkable life. I'm Martha Freeman. I've been Dan's friend and neighbor in State College, Pennsylvania for 17 years. Earlier this year, Dan and I sat down with filmmaker Eric Hamilton to talk about his life story. The result is a collection of short films, each focusing on one facet of Dan's life. In this segment, Dan talks about starting out as a professor, first at Michigan State and then at Penn State University. Okay, so you're in New York, you're at, you go to CCNY,
Yes.
You go to Columbia, you studied with Richard Hofstadter.
I had a better experience. At CCNY, I had a magnificent experience. I took courses with some of the great professors, publishers, academics in the country. Professor Hans Kohn, who is the leading national, maybe international expert in nationalism. His book, The Idea of Nationalism, was recognized as a magisterial tome with something like 100 pages of footnotes in the back and maybe 6 or 7 languages. He was a brilliant lecturer. I also had a course with Oskar Janowski, taught Jewish history. I had a course with Professor Joseph Borromée, who taught the Negro experience. And then I went to Columbia. At that time, I was interested in anti-intellectualism. I wrote to Richard Hofstadter and told him that I would like to work with him on my master's thesis. And then at the end of my master's year, I went on to NYU. I had heard from some friends that they were very receptive and were much more amenable to working with doctoral students. And I did find this to be truthful. I worked with an English man named Henry Bamford Parks, had stayed in the United States and had been teaching at NYU for many years. He had done several books. One called The American Experience during the 1940s, which was lost because it was during the World War II, and so it did not receive the attention it should have received. I had a couple of good courses there. One was with Baird Still, who was one of the great experts on New York City, had written several books on New York City, and I had a very good experience at NYU. I worked on my doctorate there on a Midwest populist who became a progressive, who became a socialist. I was interested in his trajectory, his development from populist to progressive to socialist. His name was William James Gent, G-H-E-N-T, W.J. Gent. He was eventually very influential in the upper tiers of the Socialist Party in America, but never as one of the leading people, one of the spokesmen. During World War I, he had been thrown out of the party, apparently, for disagreeing with some of the leaders. And then he spent the rest of his years, another decade or so, writing short biographies for the Dictionary of American Biography. Anyway, I found it a very interesting experience. I published one article out of the dissertation. I never published the dissertation. Then in 1963, I was still working on the dissertation. I was getting a doctorate at NYU in American civilization, which is also called American Studies or American Culture. And so I was looking for jobs in American Studies, American Culture. Michigan State University had a department called American Thought and Language, which was very much of an American Studies department. They were advertising for someone, and I was looking for a job, and so I went to Michigan State. I should say I finished my dissertation in 1964. And I did not go back to New York for the graduation. Oh. As a matter of fact, I didn't attend any of my graduations.
Do you ever regret that?
No, I don't regret it. I don't think it didn't become meaningful in any way. I mean, B would have been the only one that would have been interested. As soon as I went to Michigan State University in 1963, I became friendly with Robert Lee Green, who was in the College of Education, and Bob Green had been director of the Southern Education Project, I think that's correct, for Dr. King. He invited Dr. King to the campus in 1965. When he arrived, it's a small airport, a commuter airport, Bob Green and I met the airplane. It was Dr. King and Andy Young who accompanied him. And Dr. King said that he had a terrible headache, so we took both of them to the education building. We let Dr. King rest for an hour or so. He pulled the shades down of the room, brought him some hot tea. About an hour later, when we went back, his headache had either diminished or was gone, and he then gave a wonderful speech without any notes, one of his first early anti-Vietnam speeches to a huge auditorium at Michigan State University. Then we had dinner, and then the next morning he wanted to see one or two of the Lansing churches. Michigan State University is in East Lansing. So we drove over to a church, and I don't remember the name, and then we drove him to the airport. And on the drive to the airport, I became engaged in a little bit of a conversation with him. And one thing I remember, I asked him about his wife, Mrs. King, Coretta Scott King, and I remember that he said something like, "She was my rock," and that word was just came right out of the blue. It completely surprised me, but it was extraordinarily strong. Somehow we continued to talk a little bit. I told him what I was interested in, what I'd been doing. Then when we got to the airport, Andy Young went up into the airplane first. King went up the steps and turned around. And he's turned around, and I put up two fingers and put out my hand. I said, "Peace." And he said to me, shook my hand, he said, "Shalom." And I thought that was so nice and so warm. And he went away.
Was it exciting? I mean, did you have a sense of this as, like, you know, a huge historic moment? I don't know.
The moment that I saw him, almost unlike anyone else I've ever seen, his eyes were magnetic. There was the charisma that people spoke about just came right out of his eyes. You knew this was an incredible personality. And yet, in conversation, he could also be calm and relaxed and could chat with you, which was very nice, very much appreciated. I stayed there from 1963 to 66. It was a very nice department, very nice people. I enjoyed the Michigan State experience, but somehow B and I did not feel at home in the Midwest. I can't explain why, but in the second year we both agreed that we should start looking to perhaps get back east if we can. We went to Harrisburg. We lived actually just north of Harrisburg, and Moss went to school there. Ruth went to kindergarten. Moss was, I think, 3 or 3.5 or 4, something like that. He was born in New York. Ruth was born in Michigan, so she would have been a baby. I commuted several miles down the main highway there to the campus, which was actually south of Harrisburg, near a little town called Steelton. The Capitol campus had been a big Air Force base, which had been abandoned by the Air Force. It was a huge single building. This would have been 1966. To my recollection, something like 15 professors and maybe 20 or 30 students the first year. The second year it became a little bit more enlarged. They were able to attract more students, a few more professors, and so on. But there had been one rather unfortunate incident at the end of the first year. We, the assembled faculty, had been searching for a dean of faculty who would come in on the second year, and we had sent out ads, and we had interviewed 2 or 3 people, and we were about to interview another person, I think, when suddenly we were told that the dean of faculty had been selected, and he was brought on campus by the president of the university. And to our dismay, we had no say in the appointment of this dean. One person, Carl Hausman, who was in philosophy, came up to University Park as the chair of the philosophy department. At the end of the first year, I began to be disaffected by what was happening, and so I made a decision also to come up to University Park, but at the end of the second year. Originally, I had an arrangement with the University Park faculty people that if it didn't work out for whatever reason, I would certainly be welcomed at University Park.
Oh, I see.
So in the second year, I came up to University Park.
Why did you want to start out in Harrisburg at the Capitol campus?
That's where the job was at the time. The vista, the way it was described, was a very exciting thing to read. It was going to be a very innovative university, a new university in the Harrisburg area. There would be new courses. We would have great flexibility in academia. We would not necessarily follow University Park. So it all looked very innovative. But what we found out when we got on campus there, especially by the end of the first year, was that indeed this wonderful freedom that we thought we were going to have was very much constricted. I don't know where it came from. It could have been, or it could have been just the structure of Penn State, and that or maybe it was the dean, I don't know. But in any case, the first year, which looked so promising, began to close in by the end of the first year, and by the second year, we were already under certain restrictions, and our vista was closed.